Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, for joining us from wherever you happen to be. I am in the Orkney Islands off the north coast of Scotland on another wild and windy day. So I'll be presenting this alongside Bonnie Khan, and she and I worked together in Shell a few years ago now. Before we get started, we'll just do a quick background as to who it is that's talking to you today. For myself, I very much grew up in emergency response. My father set up the Offshore Rescue Centre, which was part of the initial look at industry safety when oil and gas started in the UK. So I was the test dummy in a dry suit for many a man overboard exercise and helicopter and cliff rescue and all the rest of it. In the early 90s, I was doing a lot of the flood work that was starting to appear here in the UK, working with Northampton Police and fire services on their emergency planning and training. I went into doing operational risk and threat analysis with the Met Police on the River Thames, and then worked with Highlands and Islands Airport on their emergency plan and training to do with their water rescue. That eventually took me on to work in Uganda, where I was the CEO of a small NGO called National Lake Rescue Institute. And we worked with UNHCR on moving refugees back into the Sudan. We were the CSR project for Tullow Oil when they first started down there, and we worked with Peace Corps. We had 5 rescue stations dotted around Uganda, and eventually that took me to work in Ghana and in Gambia as well. I went back to university and did my master's in communications, but naturally enough, crisis communications was a place that I particularly enjoyed, and it happened to be that the year I went back was unfortunately the 2 helicopter accidents that the North Sea had. So I did my thesis research in the post-crisis response that the industry took to those, and so it's become a little bit of a field for me, blending my original background with this fairly new direction for me, relatively speaking. When I'm not doing this, my particular passion is dog sledding. I spend a lot of time in the Arctic chasing dogs around, which is a good way to forget about everything, and generally being in the outdoors. So I am now here in the near Arctic at least, and I'll let Bonnie talk for herself, and then she's actually going to start the introduction and I'll take over again at the end. So I'll speak later.
Great. Thank you very much, Joanna. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming and joining us this morning. So you'll see that Joanna and I have a lot of things in common in terms of experience. However, I am not a dog sledder and I don't like being thrown into the ocean. I'm a Caribbean girl. I started off in journalism and then I moved into marketing communications and spent quite a long time as a consultant. I was a consultant in various fields from 2003 to now. Those fields included scenario planning, where I worked with companies like Unilever, ABN AMRO, organizations like the UK government, and Shell, obviously, who are very well known for their scenario planning. And I have spent quite a lot of time as well in the oil and gas industry, in particular in internal and change communications. I'm a trained crisis communicator, and basically it's my passion. Communications is my passion. I think everything you need to do needs to be done well, and it's the first response that always gets you going in the right way. So that's a little bit about me. I'm originally from Trinidad and Tobago. I live in Italy now, but I've also lived in London and The Hague. So I've worked a fair few places and literally done work around the world as well. So let's get started, being very aware of time. So the aim of our presentation today is to just provide you with a few clear steps to help you get started on your crisis communications planning. I think it doesn't need to be said that we are in the midst of a crisis. In many parts of the world, there are new crises erupting almost daily. So this is just to get your head around how you can start doing it. I'll just leave this here. We're going to cover very quickly what's a crisis, why have a plan, how do you write your plan, who's on the team, where does the plan live, and a bit more about stakeholders and how to develop your plan. So if I can ask everyone a quick question, 5 seconds, think about it, put it in the chat box. What is one thing that everyone has learned in 2020? So if you want to type anything into the chat box, let's see what's coming up. Yes, we do know what a crisis is. Resilience, yes, we're learning. Some of us are still learning. That is absolutely right. Nothing is normal at all. So I think what we've all learned is that we can all actually experience a crisis. It's whether we're directly impacted with it. I'm in Italy, so I've been directly impacted by what's been going on here, but so has everyone else. So this alone underlines the need to start developing your crisis communications plan or looking at it again if you do have one. So what is a crisis? I'm not going to read out these definitions. I am just going to look at the words that I've highlighted in green. It's potentially negative or has a potentially negative outcome. It has the ability to interrupt normal business or even threaten the existence of your organization. It's usually unpredictable, rare, unexpected, and it needs attention immediately. Now, because we are in the midst of a crisis, so basically, you might think that a crisis is something big and dramatic and explosive and wide-ranging, but you need to think about crisis for your organization in many different ways, in every single way that they can affect your organization. So it says here that they may be unexpected. Sure, they may be unexpected, but they may also be something that's bubbled up, something that was low-lying that's bubbled up and come to affect you pretty badly. I'll give you one example. So there was a public school rather in the UK. At the beginning of the pandemic, they obviously had to send their students home like many others. And the principal of the school sent out a letter to the parents about how they ought to pay tuition payments, which was online. So that was a supposedly fairly straightforward letter. However, that letter had, it registered nothing about the current circumstances, the fact that people were losing their jobs, that tuition payments might be difficult to make. It was, as they say, very tone deaf, and it was shared on social media. So that's a crisis for that school. So you need to think about crisis in many different ways and forms, and I'll cover a bit more about how you start thinking about the different kinds of crisis that can affect your organization a bit later on. So the point is that it's not necessarily going to be a big explosive thing. It can be anything that affects your reputation. So why have a plan? I was listening to John yesterday in his emergency response presentation, and he is absolutely right. A crisis is not going to hit you on Monday morning at 10 o'clock when you're sitting at your desk, reviewing your plan and making sure it's okay. It's going to come at an odd time. It's going to be when you just wake up, when you just not step off a plane anymore probably, but when you're not in the office, when you're nowhere near to a phone. It's going to happen at very, very inconvenient times, and this is the nature of the thing. So your plan is your secret weapon in your back pocket. You do it, you evaluate it, you review it, you practice it, you know it exists, and at the end of the day, it gives your leaders the assurance that they need. It makes sure that you talk to those people who are affected, because you do need to talk to them considerately and genuinely understand what they're feeling. And by doing that, it maintains credibility for your organization. So you start as you mean to finish, and the plan will guide you. Is it difficult to do? Yes, I won't lie, this takes a lot of time and effort. It is a lot of detail, it's a lot of research, it's a lot of brainstorming and thinking through processes. It involves very senior stakeholders, CEOs, finance managers, VPs, people who, the people who would be the front of your organization, the spokespeople. So it does involve quite senior stakeholders, and it does require regular updating. So regular updating doesn't just mean changing the dates. It means practicing it, evaluating your response, and adjusting to suit. So course correction if you run a drill, if you practice it, you do need to get feedback from everyone and update it, and that makes sure that you're always, as again, borrowing from what John said yesterday, to use the football analogy, you're always match day ready to go with your plan. But there is a process, and if you do follow this process, it will help you to respond under pressure. It is your secret weapon, you know, when you're under pressure and not able to think proactively. It will help you. What's this process? I'm not going to go through all of this in detail. It's here. You guys will be able to download this later on, and there is a checklist as well, which goes into a bit more detail about each of these steps. The first thing that you do is you set up your crisis communications team, and this will undoubtedly be related to your crisis response team or your emergency response team in your organization. If not, then you need to maybe talk to your leader, talk to your CEO about, you know, what kinds of things are in place for this, so that you can get things going and moving in your organization. The purpose, overview, and mission basically sets the mood, sets the objective of your plan, whether you want to ensure the safety of your publics, keep your business running. Again, in the checklist, there are good examples of how this can be, of what this can look like for different organizations, so you can have a look at that. And the approval and legal review is really important, because it gives you the assurance, it gives your leaders the assurance that it has been approved by everyone on the team, all the relevant people, and it's evergreen, so that you know when something happens, regardless of when that happens, your plan is ready to roll. The second thing is to identify potential crises. Now, this is where a lot of the brainstorming work will come in, because it involves identifying lots of anything that can happen to your company, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's very bad press going out about your organization. You need to list all of them and look at the likelihood of it happening, the potential impact it might have on people. So would it involve loss of life? Would it just be a social media thing that you manage there? And then you do need to list your stakeholders and anticipate how they will react. And this is the beauty in the crisis communications plan, is that by anticipating all of this in advance, you can plan for it, you can write things down, you can brief people on it, you can prepare them and train them. And hopefully they'll be in a better place when it does hit, because it's not a matter of if anymore, it is a matter of when. The third thing is to respond. So you develop your communication strategies for each crisis. And by communication strategies, I mean, depending on the crisis that you're addressing, do you set up a press conference? Do you send out a holding statement? Do you do both? Do you just have a video? Do you just respond online? So these are things that you will think through when you're brainstorming your crises and how you're going to respond to them. And oh, I just wanted to say a quick thing here about approval processes. Now, excuse me. So approval processes, in some companies, there is a lot. In many companies, there's actually communications by committee, where many people have to see it. You need to put processes in place that are much quicker, fast processes. You need to have a named person who will say, yes, this communication can go out. So you do need to have a very fast process in place for your external communications as well. And that has to be agreed and signed off in this plan. Keeping ready, again, testing regularly, and making sure that anyone who is a spokesperson for your organization is trained, specifically media trained. This is really important, because just the words that you use can put people on the wrong footing. And understanding how to be honest and how to be genuine is something that actually can be learned and should be learned and practiced as well. And then, of course, you do the evaluation, and you scan and not horizon scanning, sorry, and you scan for emerging issues, which Joanna will cover off in a little while. So when do you write your plan? When's a good time to start? I would say today, given where we are in the world, so today would be a good time to start thinking about it, start talking to people about it, looking at what you have if you haven't done so already, and really starting to think about what you need to do to get things in place. Who's on the crisis communications team? So the team's going to change depending on the type of crisis, but again, when you go through your crises, you will be able to identify who would be the right people on the team at that time to address that particular crisis. And I want to reinforce here that anyone you have as a spokesperson for your company or organization must be trained. They really ideally should be media trained. So these are the general principles. I'm not going to go through everything. I'm just going to pull out a few of them to talk about. Any reaction to a crisis must be as quick as possible, but it must be considered. And your plan helps you because you will have holding statement drafts that you can use as a starting point. Only give out known facts. So a lot of people are uncomfortable about this in a crisis because you want to seem in control and in command of things. But it is okay, because it's evolving, to say that you don't know something. It's human. We're not going to know everything. Say it and mean it and keep it simple. Move on to the next thing. And the third thing is, do not forget your internal audience. When I worked at Shell and there were various crises, they would send a note out immediately, as quickly as possible, to their own staff saying, you know, what was going on, what they were doing, what to do if approached by the media, what to talk about with your family and friends. It was extremely helpful, and it is something that you do need to consider, given that if there is a crisis, you are exposed via your staff and your employees, and they do need to know what to say. Quick thing, where does the plan live? It does sit with the communications team, but it's the CEO that activates the plan. So that's just a logistical thing. And how do you develop the plan? So how do you start thinking about crises? So if you don't know how, just look at what's happening in similar organizations to you. If you're really struggling, call up your call up your local police department or your fire department and find out what kind of things they've had to deal with in organizations close to you geographically even. Joanna is going to talk a bit more about the stakeholders, so I'm not going to cover that. And actually, you're going to talk about issues management, aren't you? So just one quick thing to say here, you do have to start engaging your stakeholders right now. So when you map your stakeholders, look at the gaps, look at the people that you're not talking to, and make a start in communicating with them. Social media, I know many people don't have complete social media channels, but it may be a good time now to look at that, and it will help you monitor as well what's going on and keep tabs on what people are saying about your company. So at that, I'm going to pass it on to Joanna.
All right, thank you. Now, just logistics-wise, it was easier for Bonnie to actually keep clicking through slides, so apologies, there'll be a little interruptions when I ask her to go to the next one. Following on, we're really looking at 3 stages of planning. So you have the pre-crisis, which is your everyday operations. Then you have your actual crisis event, and that can be fairly structured because there's things that we see ourselves on the news all the time. There's the holding statement, the press conference, the actual response to the emergency, handling the information and the questions. And then the issues really arise in the post-crisis, that long period of recovery back to business as usual, which can be short, but often is very long and often has a lot of questions. And this is where the blame issues start to come in. So how you are seen in the post-crisis phase really is a reflection of how you were seen in the relationships that you already had in the pre-crisis. And it's important as you're planning and thinking to realize that there is a continuity of dialogue that needs to start and can start now. So if I just read this out for you, the better the dialogue and the more trust that exists pre-crisis, the more transparent and honest the crisis response, the better the opportunity is for post-crisis renewal. So this really comes into stakeholder management and issues management and trying to never get to a point of a crisis. Obviously, crisis can happen in any case, but you need to be working on those things from the get-go. It's good business anyway. And then that will help you through the crisis planning process and in your post-crisis strategies as well. So if we just look at who our stakeholders and publics and partners are, this is an overview of who's likely to end up appearing in your plans as to who your audiences and stakeholders are: government, media, community, interest groups, operational support, society in general, the personal, business community, finances, and I'm sure you can add many more depending on your business and where you are. But where we were talking about planning, what we can do for each crisis is to actually think in advance, what kind of questions are they going to have? So if we just go to the next slide, I'm just going to talk and set out a scenario. I think it might make it a little easier. And I just picked the Buncefield oil refinery in 2005. It was a major explosion off the M1, which is a big motorway here in the UK. The refinery is owned by Total in Texaco. The explosions were so big that they were heard 125 miles away, and some said they were audible from France, Holland and Belgium, and even measured on the Richter scale. So this was an oil refinery explosion, a fire. That's your immediate crisis. That's your immediate event, and obviously you're going to have emergency responders looking to deal with that specifically. But this was also supplying Heathrow Airport with 30% of its fuel, and it shut down major motorways. So it became a logistics issue alongside it. So now start to think of the questions that those stakeholders are likely to have. You had issues of smoke, you had issues of groundwater pollution potentially, buildings were destroyed, 2,000 people were evacuated. And for example, there was Northgate Information Solutions was an IT company, and the damage to their property was such that it became unusable. And they did most of the IT systems for the Labour Party and Adam Brooks Hospital. So the event of the explosion and the fire then created a whole load of cascading crises, which is something that we talk to and know about. But from a comms point of view, it's really important that you start to think about who all the stakeholders really are and what questions you can anticipate from them. So the media is obviously going to ask you what caused the incident, who was injured. The community wants to know, can I go outside? Can I drink my water? The interest groups are going to say, did you have a good safety culture? Was it your fault? Your businesses around you are going to say, are you going to compensate me for my loss of building and earnings? Your employees are going to say, am I going to get paid? Is it safe for me to go back to work? When can I go back to work? So these are questions that you can start to work through and should work through and have pre-prepared answers for in as far as possible. And also realize that things do escalate and things do become crisis within crisis, and the first event can often lead to a series of events going down, and it may go on for months. The issues and the reputation damage and how you respond to the first can lead to a bigger crisis in the post-crisis period. If we go to the next slide, one of the things to help with that thinking is to identify your crisis, your stakeholders in three groups: allies, neutral, and oppositional. So if we take a classic Shell and Greenpeace, the Greenpeace could have high interest and high influence, but working oppositional to you. So you're really talking around managing issues in the pre-crisis, having a dialogue before anything happens, including talking to oppositional voices, in order that you can try and move them toward having a shared goal, shared decision-making, shared objectives, even in a small way, but to show goodwill, honest dialogue, and that you're willing to have a relationship. And those things will serve you through a crisis and into the post-crisis phase. So I have seen this grid done, but it goes a full 180 degrees. So there's basically 8 squares, and everything on the left-hand side is people working against you, And everything working on the right is people working with you. And in a campaign, in terms of issues management and stakeholder engagement, it could be that you need to engage oppositional voices, which may be unions, for example, and try and bring them over towards your positive working alongside you, instead of keeping them in the oppositional. Because again, if you have an incident, social media especially can pick up on that very quickly and use that, rightly or wrongly, in terms of what the evidence actually says or what the accident findings will say. They will dictate the pace of your reputation based on what their objectives are. And you have to be cognizant of that from the outset. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to rattle on through. If we go to the next slide. So this is basically going to be the contents page of your crisis comms plan. It looks like a lot, it is a lot. The thing to remember, pretty much all of these templates are available online. It's really a matter of knowing that you need to have them in place and that you've worked through everything that's on them. So you're looking at organizational procedures. You want to have contact information already in lists, not finding people's phone numbers at the moment of the crisis. You want to have pre-approved messaging notification lists. Who are you going to send this press release out to? Do that in advance, have approvals in advance. You're going to have your internal communication list already written out and approved. The Stark Web Fast Facts part at the bottom. What organizations will do is actually collate useful holding facts. Press need to say things and they need to have information for the news report. If you can give them data such as this office did this function for us, it was built in such and such a time, I had so many employees, it mainly liaised with so-and-so contractors, our supply chain came from wherever, filler facts that are just straightforward. And that will give them a story to write around and something to say, well, there's not much else to share, because in the chaos, information is always lacking and you cannot afford to say anything that's speculative. So what organizations will do is create a website that has that material sitting in a media center, but it's only made live in the moment of the crisis, and then that can be shared. But you do want to go through things like your key audience lists. You want to have your media training done. You want to understand what your media policy is and re-release that to employees so they know what to do if media are contacting them. You want to have guidelines, do's and don'ts for your spokesperson. You need to have a topic matter expert list. There could be technical queries that come up that you yourself are not able to answer or you need specialist help with. Have those phone numbers in advance. Seems like common sense. It's easy to forget and it's easy to let it lapse. It's easy for people to move on and things not to be updated. So don't get overwhelmed by this slide, but this is something like your contents page, what it's going to look like. All right. So just to pick out one example, here's a checklist for your first response. So whoever the crisis comms communicator is, they're going to acknowledge the call from the emergency response coordinator. They're going to go to the coordination center if you have one. And that moment is logged time-wise. It's important that things are logged in time for future accident investigation and for your own review of what happened when, because in the moment, of course, time is lost and you think something has taken 10 minutes, has taken 1 hour to do. So it's very important that you have a running log of when things actually happen. So this could be the checklist to allow that person to just settle in and get through the first part of what needs to be done, and then you're creating strategy and you're creating plans for that particular crisis at that particular point. But you're going to get briefed, you're going to prepare your holding statement, get it signed off, you're going to activate your internal communication plan, let your employees know what's happening and what you want them to do, draft your first press release or get your press conference briefing organized, get that dark web media center up and running so the press have got something to say about you. And from that point forward, you're probably planning on the hoof, looking at the questions you already had and trying to blend that with the actual information you're able to share and looking for approval. The important thing is Dialogue must continue. You must keep talking. Even if you're saying the same thing over and over, you must be available. People will want to talk and no answers. So you cannot just shut down. All right. Your first statement, probably the most important one because it sets the tone. So we're looking at doing a brief summary of the event to provide the context. Condolences if people are affected. Be very careful with apologies because apologies can be an admission of guilt, and you really need to check with your legal team where things lie with that. So if appropriate, offer an apology. Obviously review the facts, focus on what is true and known only, and so on. It runs through. Never lie or spin or misrepresent. Say that you're working with whoever the investigators are, if that's what's going to be happening. Say what's going to continue, what cannot continue. You have to instill the confidence that you can deal with the situation and appreciate the support. This is pretty much the formula for writing that first initial statement. And if you listen to statements given ongoing in any media event that happens, you'll find that this is generally what is covered and how things are approached. And we've heard it ourselves often enough just by listening to the news. This is familiar to you. So if we go on to the next, we're going to look at a specific thing, which is the social media monitoring. Excuse me. And again, this is an issues management through to post-crisis cycle. We all know how influential bloggers and social media can be, and I think we're all a bit scared of how quickly it can go the wrong direction. Where the scanning is very important. It's important to Google yourself, essentially. See where you're cropping up, where your name's coming in on LinkedIn, on Facebook, Twitter, all the social media feeds. See how you're being talked about, and actually look at anything negative being said as well as the positive. There's in general 3 ways to handle this. If it's just simply degrading comments, then it's best just to not reply at all, because people can have an opinion and they can make jokes and they can say things and they can be satirical. But if it's not doing any actual harm in terms of saying something that's false, you don't want to add fuel to the fire. So just leave it. If it's misguided comments, you can politely correct false statements before that misinformation spreads. If it's an unhappy comment, just like you would expect on a TripAdvisor or Airbnb, apologize, explain how you're going to fix the problem, and tell them what you're going to do differently in the future. But it is important that you use social media as a means of creating that organizational culture of looking to issues and trying to stop them before they become crisis. It's just like any other good safety culture. It doesn't start in the moment, it becomes part of your everyday operations. We'll go on to the next one. I'm aware that I'm ripping through things a little quickly, but I want to try and get to the end quick for you. So, like I said before, the crisis may not actually be the event. It may not be the fire or the data breach. It may be that the crisis becomes how you handled it. And we've seen this many times, where the story becomes how the organization coped or spoke to or responded to the event itself. You may have done everything right in terms of your procedures in emergency response. You may have got everybody out, but how it was seen and perceived could become the crisis. And so we need to, as I say, look at the whole cycle of issues management, horizon scanning scanning your media. Look at any newspaper or media organization that directly asked you for a story or an interview. How did they follow up? What did they write about you? How did they report it? Look at any media close to the actual geographic incident. Is there cultural things you've missed? Is there geographic little quirks that you didn't know about, but the local newspaper does, and they're talking about it? Is that going to be a thing that comes up? So you really need to develop your post-crisis strategies in response to emerging story trends and stakeholder issues. And those are going to be very difficult to plan for in advance. You just need to be aware that they could be there and not think that when everybody's back in the office, that's it done. You've got to keep your ears on the ground and keep talking and keep the dialogue and conversation going a long time after that. So we're getting to the end of our time. So we'll go on to the next one. Just to reiterate really that we're looking at building an organizational culture of dialogue with your stakeholders. It will serve you through the crisis, people will have good feeling toward you, and it can shape your tactics about what you're going to do going forward. So in the specific example that I researched personally, the issue was that there had been the helicopter crashes and also one in Newfoundland in the same month. And so the event wasn't seen as a particular crisis for the helicopter company or the operators or the platforms that they were going to. Rather, it was seen as an industry-wide crisis, and the industry as a whole tackled it because they all wanted to ensure that the workforce felt safe to go to work. So there may be, in particular crises, an opportunity and a reason to reach out to other people within your industry to plan your post-crisis response, particularly in something that is a major incident where you can expect there might be 1 or 2 years of investigation before any actual answers can be given. And this can leave families and employees with a lot of questions and in limbo, where nobody can take responsibility and nobody can really say what actually happened. And so it can lead to a feeling of discomfort. So if you can, and if you have the opportunity, you really need to try and work out a way of addressing this limbo space. So if your pre-crisis and post-crisis communication planning in certain circumstances can be melded together with a response and a recovery plan. I'm just going to skip to the next one because essentially it comes down to dialogue, and it's easy to say it. It's not so easy to do it well. So this stakeholder management is very key to making your crisis communication plan actually work. It comes back to organizational culture, and if you don't have the organizational culture that's going to have the right outlook towards its stakeholders, your planning will be much less effective. So I think we have one more slide to go. I'm rattling now because I know we're short on time. If you want to know more, there is going to be a download for this that will summarize all of this information. And this is the things that we can do at Inveroy in terms of going into more depth on each of these issues. And we'll take questions now. Thank you.
Well, Joanna and Bonnie, thank you very much indeed for issues-packed 40 minutes of information and an awful lot covered. If you do have any questions, by all means use the chat function and we can address those, but I'm also conscious that time marches on. It just struck me that that links back beautifully to the two of the issues that Stuart started right at the start on Monday morning when we spoke about the best crisis is the one that you can avoid, and not having to deal with the crisis because you've dealt with it beforehand, and your whole piece that you kept referring back to about organizational culture and dialogue with stakeholders, so that you build up what I would call the bank of goodwill, that the stakeholders are already more inclined to give you a bit of leeway, more inclined to see your point of view, rather than being that sort of oppositional quadrant that you showed in your stakeholder mapping. So thank you for everything there. It's now 10:45. If we take our 5 minutes leg stretch, whilst you're having your leg stretch, there's anything there that you'd like to ask Joanna or Bonnie, please type it in. We'll start with any quick questions that we've got for Joanna and Bonnie immediately afterwards, if there are any. If not, we'll carry straight on into Richard Hewitt and the idea of bouncing back better. But for now, Joanna and Bonnie, thank you for a really informative 40 minutes of information. The slide is up there. If there's anything that anyone wants to download or ask, please fire away. At least one of those downloads is already on our website and is able to be downloaded straight away even now. So Joanna, Bonnie, thank you. and I see Murray there is already passing on, and one or two others there, thanks as well. So thank you for that. Ladies and gentlemen, if we pause now at 10:45 and reconvene at 10:50. Thank you.